A few years ago, up in northern Scotland, two friends and I caught a late-night coach from Manchester to a small town for a week of rough camping. The main distinction between rough camping and regular camping is the use of tents. Rough campers don't bring any. Instead, we rely on ponchos or tarps to fashion makeshift shelters and sleep right on the ground. It's uncomfortable at times, but it's all part of the adventure and toughens us up. It's around 5 in the morning, and we're running on almost no sleep, trying to navigate through the Scottish countryside. Inevitably, we take a wrong turn. We still have over 6 miles ahead of us, nearly 9 hours of walking, and we manage to mess up our route within minutes. I can't believe we could be that clueless, even at such an early hour. Looking like a mismatched trio, we flag down a cyclist for directions. He's typically friendly and helpful, setting us back on track. As we turn a corner, we spot a war memorial which serves as a useful landmark. A chorus of bird calls fills the air, and we can't help but stop and rest on a bench near the monument. The memorial stands at a crossroads, and I'm reminded of the old practice of burying people who took their own lives at crossroads, which unsettles me. The rising sun bathes us in golden light as we make our way southwest towards a small bridge. The pavement is narrow, often forcing us onto the road to keep walking on level ground. As we climb a small rise, we spot our first rabbit. Seems like a good sign. We pretend to aim at it with imaginary rifles, making playful sound effects and rubbing our stomachs. The rabbit notices us and quickly darts into the hedge. We trudge on under the weight of our packs, passing a tacky roadside sign featuring plastic-looking swords and words written in Gaelic. Only in Scotland, one of us pants. We eventually reach the bridge and cross over, passing an old blacksmith's house. We follow the road up a mild incline past a secondary school before reaching a dirt path leading to the farmland. We've made good time, and there are no farm workers around, just flocks of grazing sheep and cows. The farmer's house is well kept, but the nearby cattle shed is worn down. I suspect it's home to bats. The sheep and their lambs notice us and skitter away nervously. We maneuver past the cattle shed and climb over 2 fences to avoid a massive waste pit. Unfortunately, this leads us straight to another fence, the electric kind. Is that live? Someone groans. I follow the wire with my eyes, tracing it to a battery unit. It's too high to jump over, and our packs make crawling underneath impossible. I shudder at the thought of getting shocked in a sensitive area. Scanning the ground, I spot a hefty piece of deadwood, carefully stepping around fresh cow dung like it's a minefield. Dragging the wood over, I press the fence down with it and cautiously step across, hearing the faint buzzing of electricity. We trek across 2 fields, scaling another fence between them. It's not easy with our packs. I pull out my phone to record the climb as we begin our first major ascent. Suddenly, our packs feel twice as heavy. We lean forward to keep our balance, taking strained steps up the slope. At the steepest part, all jokes cease as we focus on hauling ourselves up. Hunger sets in, but finally, our first planned rest stop comes into view. We drop our packs near the site where we camped on our last trip, stretching our aching legs. Corky pulls off his shirt, drenched in sweat, and steam rises from his shoulders. "Damn, Corky, you're actually steaming," Martin exclaims. We laugh, taking out food and tobacco. Martin and I snack on oatcakes with cheese spread while sipping coffee from his portable stove, a gadget that will become our lifeline for the week. Corky changes into dry clothes and eyes up a tin of canned breakfast, reading the ingredients out loud. The shade offers some relief, and we gaze across the rolling hills, either smoking or picking crumbs from our teeth. It's only 7 in the morning, but exhaustion makes it feel later. We estimate reaching our next checkpoint by 10, though Corky is doubtful. The earlier wrong turn wasn't enough of a setback in his mind, and he expects more obstacles. He's not wrong. After a slow, steady march along the ridge, we arrive at a small cluster of houses, our next landmark. We debate our route and decide to cut across a cow field to avoid another menacing electric fence. Halfway across, I notice the cows staring at us. Normally, this wouldn't be alarming, but their sheer numbers and fixed stares make me uneasy. "They're watching us," I mutter. "They're just curious," Martin replies. Then the cows start moving toward us in a slow but deliberate line. "They're coming this way now," I say. "They just want a closer look," Martin insists. That's when they break into a trot, then a full lumbering charge. Corky freezes before stepping backward. They're running at us. I look around and spot a fenced enclosure with electrical wiring. "Run for it," Corky yelps. Under the weight of our packs, our sprint is more of a frantic hobble. I realize the electric fence might be a better alternative than being trampled. "Don't run," Martin shouts. The command snaps something in my brain, and I instinctively stop, whip around, and throw my arms up to look bigger. Corky follows suit. Miraculously, the cows hesitate. Some stop altogether, others slow down. From the other end of the field, a voice shouts. The farmer is waving us toward the gate. "Just keep moving," Martin urges. We stay compact, arms outstretched, as the cows jostle around us. They seem more interested in each other than us, with some even climbing over one another to get a better view. Shaking, I scramble over the wooden gate as the farmer approaches. "Ach, they're just curious. Wanted a wee look at ye. If you'd gone across instead of along the edge." "Well, I dunno," he trails off. "Can you point us toward a road to the nearest village?" Ask. I follow this road, take a right at the main one, and stick to it. "Don't wander into the farms," he advises. "Cheers, mate," we say, grateful for his help. He seems mildly amused but mostly annoyed at the fuss we caused. Every time I tell this story, people laugh. I get it. 3 city guys getting spooked by cows is pretty funny, but in the moment it was terrifying. When we got home and looked it up, we realized just how much danger we had been in. Cows kill more people every year than sharks do. It usually happens just as I described. Hikers take a shortcut through a field instead of sticking to the edge, and they get trampled. The UK Safety Board has even advised farmers not to keep mother cows with calves in public fields because of incidents like this. So next time you think about cutting across a field, make sure it's empty. You might be in for a nasty, unexpected surprise. The oldest of its kind in the southeastern United States, nearly 2 million acres of untouched wilderness make for some of the most incredible hunting grounds imaginable. In fact, it's said that the name Quapaw is derived from an old indigenous word meaning great hunt far from home. So, as you can imagine, during hunting season, the place is flooded with bright orange vests and high visibility caps. My friends and I have never really been into hunting. We're about as East Coast as they come. Until we visited Louisiana, I had barely even traveled past New Jersey. Our idea of enjoying the outdoors didn't involve skinning freshly killed game. So when we found out that there was a period during the height of summer when hunting in the Quapaw was strictly off limits, we were beyond thrilled. There would be entire sections of the forest that were practically empty. We'd have the whole place to ourselves. Or so we thought. We spent 3 days driving nearly 8 hours a day to get from our home in Lowell, Massachusetts, all the way down to Louisiana. The thought of driving 1,500 miles in one stretch made us sick, so we turned it into a little road trip. We stopped in Baltimore, Richmond, and Memphis. Honestly, I think I could move to Richmond just for the hush puppies. I saw them on a travel show and had to try them. Trust me, they did not disappoint. By the time we finally made it to Quapaw National Forest, we were more than ready to leave the burdens of civilization behind and soak up the peace and purity of nature, which is just a fancy way of saying we were excited to drink ourselves silly around a roaring fire and scream along to Irish folk songs at the top of our lungs. And we did, maybe with too much enthusiasm, because after just 2 of the 4 nights we planned to camp in the Quapaw, we ran out of beer and smokes. Not exactly great timing either. It was late afternoon when we checked our cooler and realized we only had 3 untouched cans left, barely enough for the long walk to the closest liquor store. Backwoods Spirits was little more than a wooden shack on the edge of a small town called Pine Hollow. It took us 3 solid hours of hiking to get there, but I promise you, it was worth every step. At first, we weren't sure if we had wandered into a liquor store or a hunting lodge. The place was decorated with taxidermy. Black bears, deer, turkeys, even a few foxes. Jeff, the owner, showed us around and introduced us to some locally made wines and spirits, even letting us sample a few of his homemade brews. We walked in thinking we'd grab a six-pack or two, but we left with our backpack stuffed full of beers, some of Jeff's homemade jerky, a few little bottles of moonshine, and a bottle each of something Jeff called barrel-aged Goliath, a local stout that was 11%. Yep, you read that right, 11%. The sun was just starting to dip below the horizon by the time we were anywhere near our campsite. Our feet were aching from hours of hiking, but the booze we sipped along the way numbed it a little. I had already cracked open my own pack of jerky, passing out strips in the hopes that it might soak up some of the alcohol. We were at that point in the drinking session where bladders were full, so every once in a while we had to stop for someone to wander off the trail and relieve themselves. It was a beautiful evening. Crickets chirping, bats swooping overhead, squeaking softly as they hunted for insects. When it was my turn to take a break, my friends sat down on the edge of the trail with their beers, while I wandered into the woods to find a decent spot. I did my business and was about to head back when I heard something through the trees, voices, hushed and urgent, along with the sound of footsteps rustling over dried leaves. In my half-drunk state, I thought maybe I'd stumbled across some fellow campers. Maybe we could have a few drinks together, share stories, make some new friends. But these people were not looking for friends. I pushed through a patch of thick brush and into a small clearing, and the second I did, I realized I had made a terrible mistake. 3, maybe 4. Men turned to look at me, their faces twisted in expressions of angry surprise. They wore rough clothing, torn jeans, scuffed up leather boots, and old denim jackets. Every one of them was holding some kind of weapon, machetes, Bowie knives. One guy clutched a rusted, spiked club that looked like something out of the Dark Ages. And between them, writhing on the ground, was a young woman, bound and gagged, her skin mottled with bruises and scrapes. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Never in my life had I heard anything as gut-wrenching as the muffled noises she made through her cloth gag. When I finally tore my gaze away from her, I looked up at one of the men standing over her. He was smiling. With one slow, deliberate motion, he raised a single finger to his lips. I turned and walked away, slowly at first. I didn't want them to think I was panicking, didn't want them to assume I was about to call for help. I tried to stay calm, but after just a few steps, I broke into a sprint, tearing through the trees back toward the trail. The second my friends saw my face, they knew something was wrong. They didn't ask questions. They just ran. We ran and ran until one of my buddies threw up all over himself. Beer, jerky, and pure fear. But by then, we were out of danger. No one was following us. When I finally told them what I had seen, a heated argument broke out. One of my friends wanted to call the cops immediately. The other insisted we needed to get out of the woods first. Calling the police would mean getting behind the wheel while we were all still over the limit, something that could land us in serious trouble. Not in Louisiana, not with their DUI laws. In the end, we compromised. We called the cops, then got out of there as fast as possible, stopping at a cheap motel before we could get pulled over and breathalyzed. We never heard back from the authorities. My friend gave them every detail over the phone, but we were never contacted for follow-up questions. Never given closure. I still wonder what happened to that girl. If she was saved, if she managed to find peace, if she's out there somewhere living a normal, happy life. But sometimes, in my darkest moments, I know she never made it out of the Quapaw. And even if she survived, part of her would always be left behind in that clearing, stolen away by men who belong to the wild. We had been brainstorming ideas for a charity fundraiser, tossing around suggestions like shaving our heads, running long-distance races, or hosting a big community event. But none of those seemed exciting enough to capture people's attention. If we wanted to raise a good amount of money, we needed to do something bold. So when I suggested hiking 18 miles into the Scottish Highlands and spending a full week sleeping outdoors, I knew it was wild enough to work. I didn't expect my friends to agree, but to my surprise, they did. The concept was simple. 7 nights, 18 miles, living on the streets for those without homes. We pitched the idea to potential donors, and the response was better than expected. By the time we set off, we'd raised around 1,250 pounds, roughly $1,500, for a charity that supports people facing homelessness. We were incredibly proud, but as our departure date approached, nerves started to set in. The Scottish Highlands are known for their harsh conditions, and the military even uses the area for training due to its rugged terrain. To make things even more challenging, we had planned the trip for early March, meaning we would likely face heavy rains and strong winds. We had to invest quite a bit of our own money into military surplus gear to ensure we stayed warm and safe for the full 7 nights. Army surplus gear was the best option, affordable and reliable, so by the time we set out, we were decked out in camouflage. Our heavy rucksacks, packed with canned food and water, weighed us down, and every mile added to our exhaustion. Pain set in shoulders, feet, knees, back. By the 15th mile, 2 of my friends had reached their limit. They insisted on calling a taxi for the last stretch. One of them complained his pack was unbearably heavy, and I couldn't help but wonder what he had packed to make it so difficult to carry. When we finally reached a freshwater lake and set up camp, I discovered the reason. He had brought an air rifle, a .22 pellet gun, which must have accounted for nearly half the weight in his bag. I was annoyed, but at the same time, I couldn't argue that it might be useful. We had a week to kill, and some target practice would definitely help pass the time. Plus, if we managed to hunt a rabbit or a pigeon, we might be able to enjoy a fresh meal. After a night of exhaustion, sitting around the fire before finally collapsing into sleep, we woke at dawn with plans for a morning hunt. We assumed the wildlife would be most active early in the day, but it turned out to be a complete failure. We didn't manage to hit a single animal. However, we did run into something unexpected. In the middle of nowhere, we pushed through a tree line and found ourselves face to face with a bleary-eyed man walking his dog. The odds of seeing anyone out here were low, yet here he was, eyeing us warily. We were a group of young men in camouflage, one of us carrying an air rifle that looked an awful lot like a real gun. We waved, he gave us a forced smile, and we all continued on our way. He didn't say a word about the rifle, so we figured he wouldn't make a big deal of it. By the time we got back to camp for lunch, we had already forgotten about the encounter. That night, after gathering firewood and sharing a few ghost stories by the fire, we settled in for another night's sleep. A few hours later, I was jolted awake. Our shelter, a makeshift tent built from a tarp, should have been completely dark inside, but light beams were cutting through the fabric. Then I heard it. "Armed police! Come out with your hands up now!" Terrified, we followed orders, stepping out of the shelter one by one, hands trembling as we raised them into the blinding glare of several flashlights. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. These weren't just flashlights. They were attached to the ends of firearms. I was so scared I'm amazed I didn't completely freeze up. "On the ground! Now!" they shouted. I dropped instantly, hands on my head, as my friends did the same. Face down in the wet dirt, we lay there as they searched our shelter. It didn't take long for them to find the air rifle. "Got it, boss?" one officer called out. I couldn't see, but it was clear from their conversation that they thought they had found a real weapon. "That's it? Just a pellet gun?" one asked. "Yeah, looks like it. Wait, you guys aren't with the military or anything, right?" "No," we all answered at once. A few of the officers stepped aside for a discussion. As it turned out, the dog walker we had encountered had mistaken us for military deserters or unauthorized personnel and reported us. Given that the area was used for military exercises, it wasn't unreasonable for someone to be suspicious. Maybe the man was ex-military himself. Whatever the case, the police seemed relieved we weren't actual criminals. Once we explained the situation, they were surprisingly understanding. "Homeless for the homeless," we repeated, telling them about the charity event. Instead of being annoyed about the false alarm, they seemed impressed. I got the sense that they actually enjoyed the excitement. It meant overtime pay and a break from routine. In the end, they confiscated only the air rifle. They let us keep our knives and fishing gear, even though we didn't have a permit for the lake. They mentioned smelling something suspicious in the air but never searched the tent, though I'm sure they would have found plenty we didn't want them to. They assured us we wouldn't be charged and simply told us, "Just don't do it again, lads." Amazingly, we even got the air rifle back later. I was convinced they would arrest us at the station under trespassing laws, but they didn't. To this day, I have no idea why we got off so easily. I like to think they respected what we were doing for charity, but realistically, I think we just got incredibly lucky. One wrong move, and things could have gone very, very differently. Even now, I shudder to think what might have happened that night. At least once a year, my stepfather's relatives organize a small camping trip in Georgia. My mom has been married to him for about 6 years now, so whenever my schedule allows, I tag along. The first time I joined was right after they tied the knot. It was just me, my younger brother, and my mom, all piling into my stepfather's truck, packed with camping gear, for the 10-hour drive from our home in Cleveland down to his home state. We had just crossed the state border into Kentucky when we pulled into a gas station to refuel. We all climbed out to stretch our legs and used the restroom while my stepfather handed some cash to an elderly station attendant. After using the restroom, I was heading back to the truck when the old man struck up a conversation. He seemed friendly at first, asking where we were headed and for how long, the usual small talk. But when I mentioned camping, his expression darkened. "You always gotta respect the wild," he warned. "It ain't as forgiving as folks think." He continued, saying not to mess with wildlife and to leave nothing behind but footprints. Any disrespect and, well, the woods have their way of letting you know you're not wanted. I assured him we would be mindful and wouldn't leave trash behind, but his expression never softened. He silently finished fueling up the truck and returned to his chair without another word. Hours later, deep into Georgia, we made one last stop before reaching the campsite. It was a nature reserve that doubled as a rest area, featuring an informational board about local plants and animals. Something caught my eye in the bottom corner of the board. 2 words etched into the plastic: "Respect nature." The exact words from the gas station attendant. It was odd, sure, but had to be a coincidence. Common phrase miles apart. No way it could be the same guy. That kind of thing only happens in cheap horror movies. I didn't mention it to anyone. Why would I? It seemed ridiculous to think there was any connection. When we arrived, we exchanged hugs and handshakes with the extended family before setting up the large tent we'd be staying in. Once everything was in place, we sat around, chatting and stuffing ourselves with barbecue. My stepfather's family was just as welcoming as he was, and I have to say, he had always been a better father figure than our biological dad. Once I got over the initial adjustment, I was genuinely happy my mom had found someone like him. After an evening of singing old folk songs by the fire, led by my step-uncle on his guitar, we finally turned in for the night. But as we reached our tent, we noticed something lying in the grass just outside the entrance: a dead bird. My little brother recoiled in disgust. It was already decomposing, and the stench that hit us made everyone gag. My stepfather reassured us, cracking a joke about how my brother's car farts smelled even worse. Then, using a stick, he carefully moved the bird away. I watched in the glow of his flashlight as he knelt down and pulled something from beneath the bird's wing: a slip of paper. When I asked what it was, he shrugged it off as nothing, but the look in his eyes told me otherwise. He was rattled. The next morning, some family members mentioned hearing footsteps outside their tents during the night. They asked around, hoping to find out who had been wandering about, but no one claimed responsibility. A strange tension crept over the group. That second night was quieter, no footsteps, but something else kept me awake. In the darkness, I heard my little brother whispering. At first, I assumed he was reading to himself, as he sometimes did before bed. But there was no flashlight. He had no book. I listened closely, straining my ears. What I heard sent chills down my spine. He was reciting the exact words from the nature board at the rest stop, word for word, using complex terms I knew for a fact he didn't know. He eventually fell silent, but I was too unsettled to sleep properly after that. The next morning, my stepfather's voice cut through the campground, unusually firm. Stepping outside, I saw why. Everyone was hurriedly packing their gear into their cars. We were supposed to stay a few more nights, but the atmosphere was tense. No one was talking, just working quickly. My stepfather told me to pack my things as fast as I could. The look in his eyes told me not to ask questions. We were on the road by noon. I was relieved to be heading home, but curiosity gnawed at me. What had happened to make everyone leave so abruptly? And what had been on that note under the bird? I waited until we got home to ask. That night, after my little brother had been carried straight to bed, I found my stepfather alone in the living room. He already knew what I was going to ask. With a heavy sigh, he finally admitted what the note had said. Go back. He had assumed it was a joke, a prank by some local teenagers or a resentful cousin who didn't like that he had moved up north. So he ignored it. But then I asked if he had heard my brother talking in his sleep. When he shook his head in confusion, I knew he hadn't. Then he told me what had made everyone pack up so quickly. One of his cousins, the one he had suspected of writing the first note, had woken up before dawn, needing to use the bathroom. Half asleep, he stumbled out of his tent, relieved himself, and turned to head back inside. That's when he saw it. A dead deer lying near the fire pit, left there as some kind of message. He rushed to wake my stepfather, and the two of them dragged the carcass away before the rest of the family saw it. But that wasn't the worst part. Whoever had left the deer had carved something into its body. Not just slashes, words. The letters weren't just cut into its flesh but formed from clotted blood, meaning the poor thing had likely still been alive when it was done. I asked my stepfather what the words said. He exhaled deeply, avoiding my gaze. Final warning. We went on a camping trip in the remote hills of northern Wales. The journey was rough, the weather was brutal, and the terrain was just as unforgiving. But overall, the trip was a success. No one got injured, no one got lost, and nothing even slightly unsettling happened. That is, until the very last night. When we arrived back in the small Welsh town where we were set to catch our bus home, we were physically and emotionally drained. 5 nights in the mountains will do that to you. We had barely slept, barely eaten. So when we spotted a little roadside cafe, we nearly cried with relief. We got plenty of stares from the locals, and honestly, I couldn't blame them. We were a mess. Our eyes were bloodshot, our hair greasy, and every piece of clothing we wore stank of smoke from huddling around campfires at night. But despite their curiosity, the townspeople were friendly. The cafe owner asked about our trip and seemed pleased by our admiration of the rugged landscape. Telling the locals how tough they must be to live in such an isolated place always earned you some goodwill. With our stomachs full, we wandered over to the town's only pub. They were just as welcoming, even staying open an extra hour, so we had a warm place to wait for our late-night bus. When we finally left, about 20 minutes before our ride was due, we made sure to thank the staff before stepping out into the chilly night. The village had very few streetlights, and the bus stop was next to a small bridge that crossed the river running through town. The dim glow from the flickering lamps let us see the bridge itself, but not what might be on it at any given moment. We were exhausted, counting the minutes until we could go home to hot showers and warm beds. That's when we heard it. A noise from across the river, a low, guttural grunting. Too tired to care much, we ignored it at first, but the noise grew louder and more aggressive. Someone was over there, someone who sounded drunk, someone who sounded angry. One of our friends, curious despite the exhaustion, mustered up the energy to go take a look. I wasn't watching, but I could hear his boots thudding against the metal bridge as he climbed up, slow and cautious. Then suddenly, his footsteps came racing back down, much faster than they had gone up. Grab your stuff, now, he hissed, trying to keep his voice low. Move. I thought it was some kind of joke, a last-minute attempt to spice up our trip, but when I saw his face, I knew he was serious. I had never seen him that scared before. As if to confirm his panic, we heard the same footsteps pounding on the metal bridge. Someone was running across, and they were making the same furious, slurred noises we had heard before. None of us wanted to take a chance. We snatched up our heavy backpacks and hurried across the road into a narrow, dark alleyway, trying to stay hidden while keeping an eye on the bridge. Then we saw him. A man staggered down the bridge's stairs, something glinting in his grip. A long, sharp blade reflected the dim streetlights. "Oh, hell, is that a machete?" someone whispered. The man must have heard us because he suddenly lifted the weapon and pointed it toward our hiding spot. "You!" he bellowed, his thick Welsh accent slurred with rage. Then he charged down the bridge, swinging the blade wildly as he ran. We bolted, sprinting down the darkened streets. We had no idea where we were going, just anywhere away from the knife-wielding lunatic. Whoever was leading us must have realized we couldn't go too far. If we missed the bus, we'd be stranded for 2 days before another one came through. He explained this the first chance he got, and we all realized the awful choice we had to make. Go back and risk running into the guy again, or stay hidden and miss our only ride home. It felt like a military operation. We moved in pairs, watching each other's backs and scanning for any sign of him. Somehow, we made it back to the bus stop without running into him. We thought we had lost him. We started to relax. Then, about 5 minutes after our bus was due, panic set in again. What if we had already missed it? What if we were stuck here with that man roaming the streets? As if summoned by our worst fears, a shadow emerged from a side street. It was him, and he was still holding the machete. "You!" he bellowed again, stepping toward us. This time, something snapped in us. Maybe it was adrenaline, maybe sheer desperation. Instead of running, we stood our ground. We roared back at him, pulling out our tiny pocket knives and daring him to come closer. Looking back, it was ridiculous. 6 exhausted campers waving little Swiss Army knives at a maniac with a full-sized machete. But in that moment, we felt invincible. He hesitated, but not for long. He began pacing erratically, zigzagging toward us, still brandishing his weapon. A sick feeling crept over me. Someone was going to get seriously hurt. Then, from down the road, headlights appeared. A police van turned the corner and sped toward us. It was like something out of a movie, the cavalry arriving just in time. Our courage surged, and we actually started advancing on the guy, pushing him back toward the approaching officers. He was so focused on us that he didn't even notice the van screeching to a halt behind him. Only when 3 burly-looking policemen jumped out did he finally realize what was happening. They tackled him hard. The crack of his skull against the pavement was sickening, but we felt no sympathy. We cheered as the lights in nearby houses flicked on and curious faces appeared at windows to watch the scene unfold. And just as all of this was happening, our bus finally pulled around the corner. We grabbed our bags and all but sprinted toward it, eager to leave that nightmare behind. The police wanted to ask us some questions, but when we explained this was our only way out of town, they let us go. We promised to give statements over the phone, but we never did. We just wanted to forget. I used to love camping. I still do. But now, every trip ends with the same thought. I just hope the last night goes smoothly. Every waking moment was either spent camping or planning the next outdoor adventure. I loved the wilderness, far from the stifling predictability of daily life and its trivial concerns. I used to camp in a rugged way, constructing shelters instead of carrying a tent, drinking from flowing streams, and hunting or trapping food. So, in May of last year, 2 friends and I set off for a 4-night trek along a remote mountain trail. With over 50-pound backpacks, we trudged 20 miles into the thick, rolling hills before arriving at our first major water source. A long, peaceful stretch of clear water nestled in a scenic valley. The journey took 2 grueling days, nearly 18 hours of continuous hiking. The weight of our packs bore down on us with every step, but the feeling of accomplishment was exhilarating. Days turned into nights as we continued along the trail, gathering what food we could along the way. The trek was exhausting, a constant battle, yet the serenity of nature was unmatched. In the evenings, we speared sausages on sticks, roasting them over the fire while warming sweet cider in tin cups. We listened to owls calling through the darkness and watched the embers drift skyward like fireflies as sleep pulled at our eyelids. We found plenty of fruit and water was never scarce, but finding protein proved more difficult. We couldn't locate any bird eggs, lacked the skill to trap rabbits, and our makeshift fishing rods failed to catch anything substantial. Hunger gnawed at us, and though energy bars and peanut butter sustained us, we knew we needed real food. That meant hiking to the nearest town, roughly 7 miles away. Navigating the unfamiliar terrain, we soon lost our way. After several hours of walking, we decided to climb a steep hill as a shortcut. As we ascended, I noticed thick fog sitting at the peak, about 500 meters above. But it wasn't exactly sitting, it was waiting. The moment the temperature dipped, the mist rolled down toward us, enveloping everything in a dense, eerie white. I recall seeing my friend Mark ahead of me, his figure growing faint in the shifting fog. We tried to stay upbeat until we noticed the scattered remains of newborn lambs. May was lambing season, so this wasn't necessarily strange, but the carcasses were untouched. No scavengers had disturbed them, and there were too many of them. Relief washed over us when the outline of a small house emerged through the mist. We had no idea where we were. There was no mention of a house on our map. Our legs ached, and our water supply had dwindled. Unprepared for such a long detour, we decided to stop and ask for directions. A low, crumbling stone wall separated us from the house. Oddly, it was built into the hillside, isolated from any visible road or path. The place appeared entirely cut off from the outside world. As we reached the front gate, if it could be called that, we hesitated. It was a crude arrangement of tree branches haphazardly lashed together with rusted wire and rotting string. Mark tried to push it open, but there were no hinges. It simply fell forward into his hands. Confused, he set it aside as we stepped into the overgrown courtyard. Weeds poked through the cracks of broken concrete beneath our boots. Scattered throughout the unkempt yard were strange objects arranged in odd, deliberate positions. Small toy cars dangled from a sapling in the middle of the lawn, along with a hairbrush and a faded tennis ball. A wheelbarrow, caked in grime, rested near the tree, filled with damp books, old vase tapes, and a battered action figure. The toys and objects were eerily arranged in a rough circle around the figurine. Nervously, I reached out to knock on the door, feeling an unexpected weight in my arm. I rapped 3 times, and the door shuddered under my touch. Silence. I leaned toward a dirty window, squinting through the grime. Inside, I glimpsed a cluttered mess of unrelated objects stacked on shelves and tables. I turned to Mark and casually suggested we move on. Clearly, no one was home, but he didn't answer. Something about him was off. He looked pale, disoriented, like he was trying to make sense of something horrible. He had been peering through the grimy window, getting a much clearer view inside than I had. Then, without a word, he started shaking his head violently. His breath hitched as he turned and bolted from the courtyard. I was startled, confused, and shouted after him, demanding to know what was wrong. Sure, the house was unsettling, but he was acting as if he had seen a ghost. Finally, through clenched teeth, he managed only one sentence. "We need to leave, now." That night, as we nursed beers by the fire, I found the nerve to ask him what he had seen. He shook his head the same way he had earlier, struggling to form the words. Then he finally explained. Someone had been inside that house the entire time, hiding. As I had knocked on the door, they had peered out, directly into Mark's eyes. He said he had never seen a face so disturbingly wrong. He couldn't tell if the person had a deformity or if they had been brutally beaten, their features rearranged beyond recognition. But what shook him most was the terror in their expression. Whoever it was, they weren't just watching us. They were hiding from something else, something that was out there, something that could have returned at any moment. I still thank whatever luck we had that we never found out what it was. Back in the summer of 2013, a few buddies and I planned a small camping trip to a forest a few miles outside my friend's hometown. Birchwood Forest, though not very large, gave us the perfect opportunity to reconnect with nature. City life has its perks, but it can feel suffocating. so any chance to escape to the countryside was welcomed. As the trip date got closer, things started to fall apart. One by one, our friends messaged to say they couldn't make it, whether it was a family emergency, being short on cash, or just flaking out. In the end, only 2 of us actually went. So, on a warm summer morning, we hopped on a train heading toward the forest. The weather was ideal. Clear skies with a gentle breeze that made the hike through the woods much more bearable than expected. It didn't take us long to find a good spot to camp, a shaded area right by a small creek, perfect for washing up and drinking water. The only problem was that it was too open, easy to spot from a distance, and not exactly discreet. By late afternoon, after a tiring hike, we decided to start a fire to cook dinner. Now, having a fire is a basic part of camping, but it also acts like a beacon, sending out the scent of burning wood and food, the smoke practically announcing our location to anyone nearby. So, it wasn't a total shock when a group of locals wandered into our camp to say hello. At first, they seemed friendly, but something felt off. It's strange how our instincts pick up on things. Tiny cues in body language or the way someone speaks that set off alarm bells. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I didn't trust them. Maybe it was the odd way they glanced at each other, or the weird, probing questions they asked. Either way, once they moved on and were out of earshot, my friend suggested we relocate. He's usually the one I tell to relax and stop overthinking things, but this time, I knew he was right. Maybe we were just being overly cautious, but in situations like that, it's better to be safe than sorry. So, exhausted and slightly buzzed, we packed up, put out the fire, and started looking for another spot. Fortunately, we found one quickly, a dense, wooded hill overlooking our old campsite. We couldn't see it directly, but if you walked a bit from our new spot, you'd get a decent view of the area, at least during the day. As the sun dipped below the trees, we built another fire, cooked some instant noodles, and drank ourselves into a comfortable haze. We sat around the fire, talking nonsense, laughing, and smoking until we were too tired to continue. Then we crawled into our makeshift shelters for the night. I must have passed out almost immediately because the next thing I remember is waking up to the distant sound of a car engine revving in the dark. At first, I was just annoyed to be woken up. My head was pounding from the drinks, and I felt like garbage. But as the engine noise grew louder, something in me said to pay attention. When I started hearing voices, I realized it wasn't just some random car in the distance. It was getting closer. Maybe it was just a group of kids messing around in a stolen car. But I had a bad feeling. Curious, I crept to the edge of the hill. My blood ran cold. Flashlights flickered across our old campsite, their beams darting through the trees. The revving car had been driven right down the forest trail to where we had been camping. Someone was looking for us. I didn't even think. I just moved. As quietly and quickly as possible, I rushed back to wake my friend. Half asleep and still groggy from the drinks, he didn't understand at first, so I had to explain what I saw multiple times. But once it clicked, he was on his feet, helping me smother the fire. We had a pair of binoculars with us, so we grabbed them and scrambled back to the hill's edge. What we saw made our stomachs drop. The men down there, maybe 5 or 6 of them, were carrying things. The flashlight beams illuminated the objects in their hands. Baseball bats, hammers, and what looked like a coil of rope. They were furious, swearing and kicking at the remains of our fire, cursing that they had arrived too late to find us. All we had for protection were our small camping knives. If they had decided to search the area, they would have found us easily, and I doubt I'd be here to tell the story today. But by some miracle, they didn't. Maybe they were too drunk themselves or just too lazy to go looking. Whatever the reason, we were unbelievably lucky. With one of us keeping watch, the other hurried back to pack up our gear. The group of men stayed at our old campsite for a while, venting their frustration by smashing things and kicking through what we left behind. It was clear they weren't in any rush to leave, which meant we were trapped on that hill. If we tried to sneak away with our heavy packs and got spotted, we'd never outrun them, especially since they had a vehicle. So we waited. Neither of us slept that night, even after the men finally drove off. I kept fearing they'd come back with more people, more flashlights, and a stronger determination to find us. But they never did. By the time the sun rose, they were probably passed out, nursing their own hangovers. As much as we wanted to stay and enjoy the trip, we weren't about to risk another night with those guys lurking around. We packed up and caught the earliest train home. I was frustrated that we had to cut the trip short, but in the end, our safety was more important. Whether you're traveling abroad or just exploring a nearby forest, always be cautious. There are a lot of good people out there, but some are anything but friendly.